A woman woke up in a care home, with no memory of how she got there. Her husband said he'd come back. Her sons came once, looked her in the eyes, and said they had never seen her before. By the time she realized what they'd done, it was already too late. Or so they thought. Before we go any further, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We love hearing from you. And hit that subscribe button so you never miss stories like this. Diane Crowley had been in the Maplewood care home for 6 weeks when she finally stopped counting days. At first, she marked them carefully, waiting, watching the door, telling herself Richard would come back any moment to explain why he'd left her here without warning. But Richard never came. And when her sons finally showed up 2 weeks in, she thought it was over. Thought the nightmare was ending. Thought they'd come to take her home. Instead, they stood in the doorway like strangers at a funeral. Polite, distant, cold. "I think you're confused," the older one said when she called his name. "We're not your family." Diane's legs went weak. "Stop," she whispered. "Please. It's me. It's your mother." But they didn't stop. They turned to the nurse, apologized for the confusion, mentioned something about memory issues, and walked out without looking back. Not once. That was the moment Diane understood what had really happened. Her husband hadn't just left her here. He'd erased her. The morning Richard drove Diane to Maplewood, the sky had been overcast and gray, the kind of morning that felt heavy before it even began. She remembered sitting in the passenger seat, watching the familiar streets of their neighborhood disappear behind them, replaced by wider roads and unfamiliar buildings she didn't recognize. "Where are we going?" she'd asked for the 3rd time. Richard didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the wheel, his jaw set in that familiar way that told her he wasn't going to answer. "Richard," she said again, quieter this time. "Please, just tell me where we're going." "You'll see," he said finally, his voice flat and emotionless. That should have been her first warning. But Diane had spent 43 years trusting this man. 43 years believing that even when he was cold, even when he was distant, he had her best interests at heart. So she didn't push. She sat back in her seat and watched the world go by, trying to ignore the knot of unease growing tighter in her stomach. When they pulled into the parking lot of Maplewood Care Home, Diane felt her breath catch. "Why are we here?" she asked, her voice shaking now. Richard turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, staring straight ahead. "You need help," he said quietly. "What?" "You need help, Diane. You haven't been yourself. You forget things. You get confused. I can't keep doing this on my own." Diane's heart was pounding now. "I don't understand. I'm fine." You're not fine," Richard interrupted, and for the first time, he looked at her. His eyes were hard, cold. "You haven't been fine for a long time." Diane opened her mouth to argue, to defend herself, to say something that would make him see reason, but the words wouldn't come. Because part of her wondered if he was right. She had been forgetting things lately. Small things. Where she put her keys. What day of the week it was. Names of people she'd known for years. But everyone forgot things sometimes. Didn't they? Inside, the building smelled like disinfectant and something else Diane couldn't quite place. Something sterile and sad. Richard walked ahead of her, his stride confident and purposeful, like he'd been here before. Like he'd planned this. A woman in scrubs met them at the front desk, her smile warm and practiced. "Mr. Crowley," she said, shaking Richard's hand. "Everything's ready. If you'll just follow me." Diane stood frozen, watching the exchange, her mind struggling to catch up. "Richard," she said quietly. "What's happening?" He didn't answer. He just turned and followed the woman down a long hallway, and Diane, not knowing what else to do, followed him. The room they brought her to was small and plain. A single bed, a nightstand, a window that looked out over the parking lot. "This is where you'll be staying," the woman said gently. "Just for a little while. Until you're feeling better." Diane turned to Richard, panic rising in her chest now. "I don't want to stay here. Please, just take me home." But Richard wouldn't look at her. "It's for the best," he said, and his voice was so calm, so matter-of-fact, that it made her feel like she was the one being unreasonable. "No," Diane said, her voice breaking. "Please, don't leave me here." Richard finally met her eyes, and what she saw there made her blood run cold. Nothing. No warmth. No regret. No love. Just nothing. "I'll come back soon," he said, and then he walked out. Diane stood in the center of that small, sterile room for a long time after he left, her mind racing, her heart pounding, trying to make sense of what had just happened. She told herself it was temporary, that he'd come back tomorrow and explain everything, that this was just a misunderstanding. But deep down, in a place she didn't want to acknowledge, she knew he wasn't coming back. The first few days were the hardest. Diane barely slept. She spent most of her time sitting by the window, watching the parking lot, waiting for Richard's car to pull in. It never did. The staff were kind but distant. They treated her like every other resident, with patience and professionalism, but no real warmth. She tried to explain to them that she didn't belong here, that there had been a mistake, that her husband would come back and clear everything up. But they just smiled and nodded and told her to rest. And slowly, Diane began to understand that no one was listening. It was 2 weeks later when her sons finally came. Diane was sitting in the common room, staring blankly at a television she wasn't watching, when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned, and there they were, her boys. Her heart leapt. "Oh, thank God," she breathed, standing up quickly. "I've been waiting for you. I've been trying to call, but they won't let me use the phone and—" "Excuse me," the older one said, cutting her off. His voice was polite, distant. "I think you have us confused with someone else." Diane froze. "What? We're not your family," he said calmly. "I think you're confused." Diane felt the room tilt. "No," she whispered. "No, stop. It's me. It's your mother." But they didn't react, didn't soften, didn't show any sign of recognition. The younger one turned to the nurse standing nearby. "We're sorry. She's been having memory issues. We didn't mean to upset her." "Wait," Diane said, her voice rising now, panic flooding her chest. "Stop. Please. Don't do this. I'm your mother. I raised you. But they were already walking away. And as they disappeared down the hallway, Diane felt something inside her shatter. The days after that blurred together in a haze of numb silence. Diane stopped asking questions, stopped trying to explain herself, stopped hoping. She sat by the window most afternoons, watching cars pull into the parking lot, watching families visit other residents, watching the world move on without her like she'd never existed at all. And every single time the door opened, some small, stupid part of her still hoped it would be them. It never was. But there was one person who kept watching her. A nurse named Josie Reed. Diane noticed her in the beginning, but didn't think much of it. Josie was quiet, professional, efficient. She didn't hover, didn't ask invasive questions, didn't treat Diane like a case file. But she looked at her differently than the others did, like she saw something no one else could. At first, Diane thought she was imagining it, that grief and isolation were making her see things that weren't there. But as the weeks went on, she couldn't shake the feeling that Josie was watching her, studying her, waiting for something. It was a Thursday afternoon, nearly 6 weeks after Diane had been left at Maplewood, when Josie finally closed the door behind her and stayed. Diane looked up from where she sat by the window, confused, as Josie stood there with her hands folded tightly in front of her, her face unreadable but tense. "I need to tell you something," Josie said quietly. Diane's chest tightened. "What?" Josie exhaled slowly, like she'd been holding her breath for years. "Your sons lied." The words landed like a slap. Diane stared at her, frozen, her pulse pounding in her ears. "They know exactly who you are," Josie continued, her voice shaking now. "They came here, looked you in the face, and decided to pretend they didn't. And your husband?" Her jaw clenched. "He planned the whole thing." Diane's hands started trembling. "How do you know that?" Josie hesitated. Then she said the thing that would change everything. "Because my name isn't just Josie Reed." She paused. "It's Josie Crowley." Diane's breath stopped. The room tilted. She searched Josie's face, looking for something familiar, something she should have seen before, and suddenly it was there, buried under years and distance, and a life she'd been forced to forget. The shape of her eyes, the curve of her mouth, the way she held herself. "No," Diane whispered. "That's not possible. I was 3 when they took me," Josie said, her voice cracking. "Richard told everyone I died, that there was an accident, that you couldn't handle it. But I didn't die, Diane. I was adopted, raised 2 states away by people who had no idea where I came from." Diane couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what she was hearing. "I spent my whole life thinking I didn't have a mother," Josie whispered. "And then 6 months ago, I found the records. I found your name. I found out what he did. And I've been looking for you ever since." Tears were streaming down Diane's face now, hot and uncontrollable. When I saw your intake file, Josie continued. When I saw who signed you in, I knew. I knew he'd done it again. He erased me 30 years ago, and now he was erasing you. Diane reached for her, trembling, and Josie stepped forward and took her hands. I'm here, Josie said firmly. I'm real, and I'm not letting them do this to you. For the first time in 6 weeks, Diane felt something other than grief. She felt rage. Pure, burning, unstoppable rage. How did he do it? Diane asked, her voice shaking. How did he make everyone believe you were dead? Josie's jaw tightened. He faked a death certificate. Told the state I drowned in a lake during a family trip. Said you were too traumatized to function. That you had a breakdown. And then he gave me up for adoption through a private agency that didn't ask too many questions. Diane felt sick. And no one questioned it, she whispered. Why would they? Josie said bitterly. He was a grieving father. You were a grieving mother who couldn't cope. It was the perfect story. Diane closed her eyes, the weight of it all crashing down on her. He took you from me, she whispered. And I didn't even know. You couldn't have known, Josie said gently. He made sure of that. Over the next few days, Josie told Diane everything. How she'd grown up in a quiet suburb in Ohio with adoptive parents who loved her, but never told her the truth about where she came from. How she'd always felt like something was missing, like there was a piece of her story she couldn't access. How she'd finally demanded answers when she turned 30, and her adoptive mother, guilt-ridden and dying, had given her the sealed adoption records she'd kept hidden for decades. How Josie had spent the next 6 months tracking down every lead, every document, every scrap of information she could find. And how she'd finally found Diane's name buried in a hospital intake form filed just weeks ago. I applied for a job here the next day, Josie said quietly. I needed to see you. I needed to know if it was really you. And when you saw me? Diane asked. Josie's eyes filled with tears. I knew. Diane wanted to believe it. Wanted to let herself feel the hope that was blooming in her chest. But she'd been hurt too many times. How do I know this is real? She whispered. How do I know you're not lying to me like everyone else? Josie reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. She handed it to Diane. It was a picture of a little girl, no more than 3 years old, sitting on a woman's lap. The woman's face was younger, unlined, full of joy. It was Diane. And the little girl in her arms was Josie. Diane's hands shook as she stared at the photo, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I've carried this with me every day since I found it, Josie said softly. It's the only proof I have that you were real, that I wasn't just invented. Diane looked up at her, tears streaming down her face. You're my daughter, she whispered. Josie nodded, her own tears falling now. I'm your daughter. When Diane's sons came back the following week, they walked in expecting the same silent, confused woman they'd left behind. Instead, they found Diane standing in the center of the room with Josie beside her. And this time, Diane didn't reach for them. She didn't beg. She just looked at them the way they had looked at her. Like strangers. The older one stopped in the doorway, his expression faltering for just a moment. We just came to check on you, he said carefully. You should go, Diane said quietly. He blinked. What? I said you should go. There was no emotion in her voice. No anger. No grief. Just clarity. Mom, don't call me that, Diane said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. You gave up that right the day you looked me in the eye and told me I wasn't your mother. The younger one shifted uncomfortably. We were just trying to help Dad. He said you were sick, that you needed. He lied, Diane said simply. And you believed him. Or maybe you didn't. Maybe you just didn't care. The silence that followed was deafening. Either way, Diane continued, you made your choice. And now I'm making mine. The older one's face hardened. You can't just. I can, Diane said. And I am. Now leave. For the first time, they saw something in her eyes that made them uncomfortable. She wasn't broken anymore. After they left, Josie turned to Diane, her expression unreadable. How do you feel? She asked quietly. Diane didn't answer right away. Because the truth was, she didn't know how she felt. She didn't feel victorious. Didn't feel relieved. She just felt empty. Like something inside her had been hollowed out and would never be filled again. I don't know, she said finally. I thought it would feel different. I thought I'd feel something. Josie reached for her hand. Give it time. 3 days later, Josie helped Diane pack the few things she had. A change of clothes. A small bag of toiletries. The photograph Josie had given her. That was it. 43 years of marriage. 2 sons. A lifetime of memories. And this was all she had left. They walked out of the care home together in the middle of the afternoon, past the front desk, past the nurse's station, past the place where Diane had once sat waiting for people who would never come. As they stepped outside into the cold air, Diane stopped for a moment and looked back at the building. Josie squeezed her hand. "You okay?" Diane didn't answer right away, because the truth was, she didn't know if she was okay. She didn't know if she'd ever be okay. But she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't waiting anymore. Josie took Diane to a small apartment on the other side of the city. It wasn't much, just a one-bedroom with outdated furniture and a view of a parking lot. But it was warm, and it was safe, and for the first time in weeks, Diane felt like she could breathe. "I know it's not much," Josie said apologetically, setting Diane's bag down by the door. "But it's all I could afford on short notice." "It's perfect," Diane said quietly. Josie smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I need to go back to work tomorrow," she said. "But I'll check on you every day. And if you need anything at all, you call me." "Okay." Diane nodded. But as Josie turned to leave, Diane felt a sudden surge of panic. "Wait," she said quickly. Josie stopped, turning back. "Don't leave," Diane whispered. "Please. Not yet." Josie's expression softened. She walked back over to Diane and pulled her into a tight embrace. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Diane let herself cry. Really cry. Not the silent, swallowed tears she'd shed alone in that care home room, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. Josie held her through all of it, her own tears falling silently. "I've got you," she whispered. "I've got you." The days that followed were strange and disorienting. Diane found herself existing in a kind of limbo, caught between the life she'd lost and the life she didn't yet know how to build. Josie came by every evening after her shift, bringing food and conversation and a quiet, steady presence that Diane clung to like a lifeline. They talked about everything. About Josie's childhood. About the family that raised her. About the moment she'd found out the truth. About Diane's marriage. About the slow, creeping realization that Richard had never loved her the way she'd loved him. About the sons who'd looked her in the eye and erased her. And slowly, piece by piece, Diane began to understand the full scope of what had been done to her. It was Josie who finally suggested they confront Richard. "He needs to know that you know," she said one evening, her voice hard. "He needs to know that he didn't get away with it." Diane hesitated. Part of her wanted nothing more than to never see Richard's face again. But another part of her, the part that still burned with rage, wanted him to see her standing, whole, unbroken. Wanted him to know that he hadn't won. "Okay," she said finally. "Let's do it." They drove to the house Diane had once called home on a cold Saturday morning. It looked exactly the same. Same white shutters. Same neatly trimmed lawn. Same flower beds Diane had planted years ago. Like nothing had changed. Like she'd never been erased at all. Josie parked the car across the street, and they sat there for a moment in silence. "You ready?" Josie asked. Diane took a deep breath. "No," she said honestly. "But let's go anyway." Richard answered the door on the third knock. When he saw Diane standing on his porch, his face went pale. "What are you doing here?" he said quietly, his eyes darting to Josie. "Who's this?" "You know who this is," Diane said calmly. "Or you should, since you're the one who erased her 30 years ago." Richard's jaw tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do," Josie said, stepping forward. "My name is Josie Crowley. I was 3 years old when you faked my death and gave me up for adoption. And now I want to know why." Richard's face hardened. "Get off my property," he said coldly. "No," Diane said. "Not until you tell me the truth. Not until you admit what you did." Richard stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. And then he laughed. It was a short, bitter sound that made Diane's blood run cold. "You want the truth?" he said. "Fine. Here's the truth. I never wanted her." He gestured at Josie. "And I never wanted you. I stayed because it was easier than leaving. Because it looked good. Because people expected it. But the second I found a way out, I took it." Diane felt like she'd been punched in the chest. "You took our daughter," she whispered. "You told me she was dead. And you believed me," Richard said flatly. "Because you were weak. You've always been weak. And when I realized I could do it again, when I realized I could put you in that home and no one would question it, I did. Because I was tired, Diane. Tired of pretending. Tired of you." The silence that followed was absolute. Diane stared at him, her mind reeling, her heart pounding. And then, slowly, something inside her shifted. She wasn't weak. Not anymore. You're right, she said quietly. I believed you. I trusted you. I gave you everything I had. And you used it against me. She took a step closer. But you didn't win, she said. Because I'm still here. And so is she. And no matter what you do, you can't erase that. Richard's expression darkened. Get out, he said. We're going, Diane said. But not because you told us to. Because we're done with you. She turned and walked away, Josie beside her, and didn't look back. As they drove away, Diane felt something she hadn't felt in weeks. Not happiness. Not peace. But something close to it. You okay? Josie asked. Diane nodded. Yeah, she said quietly. I think I am. The weeks that followed were far from easy. Diane struggled with nightmares. With panic attacks. With sudden, overwhelming waves of grief that left her gasping for air. But Josie was always there. And slowly, painfully, Diane began to rebuild. She found a therapist. Started taking walks in the park. Began to imagine a future that didn't include the people who'd tried to erase her. And one day, sitting in Josie's apartment with a cup of tea in her hands, Diane realized something. She wasn't waiting anymore. She wasn't hoping for Richard to come back. Wasn't hoping for her sons to apologize. Wasn't hoping for anything except the life she was building right now, in this moment, with the daughter who'd come back for her. And that, she thought, was enough. If this story hit you hard, let us know in the comments. Have you ever been abandoned by the people you trusted most? And if you made it this far, don't forget to hit like and subscribe for more stories that'll stay with you long after they end. Thanks for listening.